Welcome to the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. Each week, we talk with accomplished content strategy experts to share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. And now here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 5th episode of the Content Strategy Interviews podcast. I'm really delighted today to welcome to the show Sara Wachter-Boettcher. She's a longtime content strategy and user experience expert, runs her own consultancy in Philadelphia, and she's super accomplished, has written a number of books that I've really enjoyed, one of which I'm still waiting to get to. I've been kind of busy lately. In any case, let me ask Sara to tell you a little bit more about herself. That's sort of the quick overview, but tell the audience a little bit more about your background, how you came from journalism to where you are today, and take it from there.
Sure. So I started out, studying journalism and, not totally sure what I wanted to do with myself, except that I knew I was really interested in writing and kind of editorial things. And after college, I ended up working at an agency that was doing a lot of website development at the time. And I was hired as their first web writer. I don't think anybody knew exactly what they meant by that, but they knew they wanted to hire somebody who had to deal with content because that was increasingly a problem. They had people who were SEO people, and they had people who were developers, and they had some designers. They didn't really have any other arm that was thinking more about how do we organize information, how do we make things appropriate for the web, and how do we help people find what they need and get things done. So I show up as a web writer, nobody knows exactly what I'm supposed to do, and I start taking on all kinds of things that to me just seemed like things that needed to be done. So asking questions about where are these sitemaps coming from? Oh, the project manager is making them? Okay, well, that's cool, but here are some ideas for ways we might want to rethink the organization there. Or let's start having more conversations between me and the designers earlier on in the process, or me with the clients earlier in the process to talk about their existing content and how we might adapt it. Or if there was going to be a migration of things, are we just going to migrate everything, or can we start cleaning house a bit? And that really progressed into taking a more strategic role and taking on, a leadership role at that particular company, but also finding this growing discipline called content strategy.
Mm-hmm. When did you first call yourself or identify as a content strategist? Do you remember?
So, yeah, I'm pretty sure it was 2008. It was around the time Rachel Lovinger wrote this article about content strategy where she called it, I think it was like the philosophy of data or something. And somebody pointed me to this article and I said, oh my gosh, a lot of this sounds like what I do and sounds like the questions that I ask. And then sometime the following year, Christina Halverson had this article in A List Apart about the discipline of content strategy. And it was somewhere in between there that I was like, I think this is what I do. And by the time Christina's article came out, I was like, okay, this is definitely a real thing, and I can point to this and say, this is an actual discipline. Look, here it is. And so it was right in there. It's, it's kind of fuzzy though, right? Because looking back, it's like, when did I start doing that sort of work? Well, I don't know. I think for a lot of us, it's like our brains were always doing that sort of work, even if we didn't have a word for it. It was like, oh, the writer is asking too many questions again,
That's right. Well, tell me about that, because you can hang with all the tech people and the information architects and the enterprise, management type folks. How did you make that transition from journalist to kind of copywriter agency to big shot consultant?
Well, I don't know about that last part. Okay. So I guess I always saw myself as a writer, never really saw myself as a copywriter per se. I did copywriting here and there, but what I really quickly realized is that when I was working with clients on their web projects, it was much less around copywriting and much more around, understanding this particular medium and how to write for this medium in a way that would make sense for the readers of it. And that wasn't actually that different from journalism. Not to say that content strategy work is the same, but there is a lot of overlap when you think about, you need to be able to ask really good questions. You need to be able to get at the heart of a matter. A lot of times organizations, they have so much content that they've accrued over the years. And part of the reason for that is that they don't have a good sense of how to figure out what's going to be really meaningful for their users. And they also often have a lot of different people contributing things that might be overlapping or duplicative, and being able to kind of look at all of that and kind of not get overwhelmed by lots of information and make sense of it and simplify it. I think that that's, just a really helpful skill. And so for me, I found that piece of the transition wasn't too difficult. And on the technical side, I never considered myself a technical person exactly. I guess I just really found that if you wanted to have good conversations with people who are making technical decisions, then you needed to understand where they were coming from, just like any other human person. And so part of understanding where they're coming from is learning a little bit more about the systems at play and sort of understanding the concerns that they have. And that does not mean that content people need to get super technical necessarily, sort of depends on their role in the job and everything else. But that, if you stop looking at it as like, oh, that whole mystery that happens over there, and you start just kind of like getting a little bit of an understanding of the sort of workflows and sort of, how concerns about databases come into play when it comes to content management, then I think you could just have good conversations.
How far down the tech rabbit hole have you gone? For example, like, did you learn HTML? Did you learn CSS? Did you learn study SQL queries and how to design databases? Like how deep have you gone on the tech side?
No, so I can write HTML. I can take some CSS and screw it up for later. I mess around with that sort of thing. But the thing is, because so much of my work is really at this strategic and sort of like organizational level, like how do you get the different people in an organization prepared to handle content differently and to make choices about content? It takes me away from getting into the implementation that much. So I don't end up doing that much in there. However, when it comes to, I don't do things like make SQL queries, but when it comes to understanding databases, that was just kind of fundamentally grokking the ideas of structure and relationships and being able to bring that kind of thinking into parts of the organization that traditionally don't have it, that are more editorial or marketing driven. That has really enabled me to help make content more focused and strategic across an organization, because you want to get writers to stop thinking about like, ooh, I'm going to write something, let me crack open a brand new Word document and start typing, and start thinking more about okay, well, what is this and why am I doing this and where is this going to go and how does it exist in the context of everything else? And is it a consistent content type that we produce all the time? And if so, what do I really need to communicate, and how, what kinds of pieces and parts does it need? That shift is so powerful for an organization that's producing content, that getting somebody who is not necessarily going to ever work on a content management system to understand 10% of what goes into content management is really, really valuable.
Right. And that, backing out of that a little bit, a lot of what you just talked about there is like this new need to kind of structure content, and then to educate people like you just said, who are most comfortable cracking open a new Word document and doing it, and kind of guiding them into this new way of creating content. And I just enjoyed content everywhere so much that set out to me like the approach. That's your book about. I'll let you talk about it a little bit. If you could just kind of, I don't want to dwell on it too much because I want to get to the fun stuff about how to actually implement it. But if you could just give sort of an overview of where that book came from and the main ideas you want people to take home from that.
Yeah, so Content Everywhere, Strategy and Structure for Future-Ready Content. So that book came out 5 years ago this month, which is kind of wild for me to think about. And
hold it up for people.
Yeah. So Content Everywhere is the real underlying, crux of that book is that increasingly, and I would say even more true now than it was when I wrote it, we need to be able to have our content go to lots of different places and be seen in lots of different ways. And for a lot of organizations, that means things like all of their content is going out over an API, and that API is getting consumed by a bunch of different applications, maybe by third parties, maybe by different front ends for different websites, et cetera. And so we need one set of content that is structured and organized that can be viewed in lots of places. But even at a more simplified scale, and I talk about this a lot in the book, responsive design even, right? So being able to have one website that can shift sizes and work effectively on a desktop, laptop, mobile phone, tablet, et cetera. That's really important for almost every organization now. And along with having a responsive site, you have to have content that's prepared for responsive design, which means content that's cleanly structured and organized and chunked out so that you can make good design decisions with it.
Right.
So, I started writing the book because I found that organizations were really struggling with this. Everything they had was sort of these big pages of stuff, and everything, was like, here's a web page, here's another web page, here's another web page. And when you start saying like, well, how should this web page adapt for different circumstances? Nobody knows the answer to that because it's just a page. And so you had to start getting more focused about like, well, no, what is this page actually doing? And then you start noticing that, okay, well, when we have product content, that follows this one pattern. And when we have, our blog posts obviously follow a different pattern. And we have white papers that follow a different pattern. And you start looking at those different patterns in the content and sort of formalizing some of those patterns that are sometimes just things people have typically done, but that are not formal structures. Then you can start more effectively getting content prepared for something like an API, which is a super structured system, or getting it prepared for, responsive design patterns where that you're going to need to have things collapse or things shift around.
Right. One way, I can't remember who, I don't know, maybe who first said this, that there's this sort of truism among content strategists that you want to have chunks, not blobs. And a lot of what you're talking about right there, I think, is extracting the relevant chunks, organizing them correctly from the original blog, whether it was a blog post or white paper or web page. One of the things I'm most intrigued about is how you help people make that transition from like the old pixel concerned graphic designer to the writer who's wedded to their little quill pen and stuff, to get them to grok that, to really get that that need to structure content. And how do people's transitions typically go? We're all in this long-term transition over the last 20 years from the old media way of doing things to the new, but would you have any insights about that?
Sure. So first off, I would give credit where credit is due. Chunks Over Blobs is Karen McGrain, who wrote Content Strategy for Mobile and a bunch of other things. She's wonderful on this stuff. And the shift from blobs of content to chunks of content, I think, is something that takes typically a good chunk of time in an organization. And it tends to take a lot of like rethinking how you do things. I've seen organizations try to do it in the context of just a migration, like, okay, we're gonna re-platform to a new CMS. And so when we do that, let's move everything to structured content. And they often find that it's so much more work than they thought it would be going in, because it requires you to take a look at everything you've ever been doing and to kind of justify it. Because if you can't figure out the chunk, then what's it there for? Right? Like if you can't look at it and say, okay, for example, we, when we have a new post of some sort, we always have a teaser chunk of content. And the reason is so that we can visually highlight that or excerpt that, so that people want to read the rest of it, which means that little teaser chunk needs to kind of contain a compelling nugget of information that would make somebody want to read further. Like that story is basically like, why does that chunk actually matter? And if you haven't thought about that, what you end up with is a lot of filler. And so what organizations find is that they had a design pattern somebody built into their system. So there's a design for a teaser and people put words there, but it didn't necessarily mean anything. So trying to really get back to, okay, why are we doing this? Why does it matter? Is it actually communicating anything important? And then what is the actual structure of that we need to build into our system, into our architecture, so that we always support that chunk of content? It's just a big process.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting, what you just said makes me think, because like it's all, in the end, it's all about that user experience at the end of the process, the whole process. But that varies so differently now. And I guess that's one of the core, it's kind of a conceptually difficult thing, or complicated thing to really grok, that need to have this little chunk of content that works this way, to contextualize things, and that probably could show up in a number of different places. I think people can get that easily enough, but for a content creator to shift into this mode of like, oh yeah, so this needs to, I guess, how do you help people get to that?
Yeah, so I think it's a series of things. It's not just one thing. So I think what people need is they need to be able to imagine some of the possibilities for their content. for a writer who's used to writing in an unstructured way and maybe comes from like even a pre-web time, or who still thinks of what they do as fundamentally about creating a finished piece, you need ways to help them envision how their content might be used. And so a lot of times it's a matter of I'll help organizations map out how would you be reusing this information. So for example, I worked with a really big company last year that was moving to sort of an enterprise-wide Drupal model. And as part of that, they wanted to get a handle on a huge amount of marketing content, some like 2 million pages of marketing content that had spread out over the universe. That's not an exaggeration, that's an actual number. And start to get that into some structured format. And the process for helping people see what's wrong was really to show them like, okay, here, for example, is a product. And here is your product description. Now, here are 17 different little bits of content about that product from different places on different marketing pages. And they're all different. And some of them are out of date because nobody realized that something had changed on the product, and so nobody changed it over here. And so you start showing them the way that this breaks down, and then you can start showing them, okay, well, as you can see, a lot of these are really similar in length, and we can start identifying like you need a short description and a long description for this product. And if you had those, you could actually, all 17 of these places where you need to talk about this product, you could talk about it using that one chunk of information. Once you start showing people that, then I think it's a whole other, it's a series of helping them learn to write a bit differently. I do a lot of writing labs that are like things like pair writing. So getting people to pair up with somebody who has some experience and like kind of learn to write differently. Templates, helping people to start, once they have started to get the process a little bit, you can give them some templates to help make sure that they're consistently writing all the stuff they need to write and getting used to doing it. And then also, what kinds of guidance and tools and kind of helpful nudges can you give people within the authoring interface itself, from basics like, help text in the author interface that advises people on like what to put in a particular field, to what's the overall experience of authoring content. So in a complex setting, you may be producing a lot of different little details, and I see this a lot in like things like journalism and media. Content management systems are kind of doing a lot, and giving people, what's the order of operations, right? So like, when do you produce, like when do you fill in what kinds of content, and what's the flow, and so like, for example, when does somebody add all of the kind of nuts and bolts pieces of it versus when do you get them to upload media versus when do you get them to like add different metadata stuff. All of that stuff needs to be really thought about. And
that really changes like, a style guide or workflow stuff, because all of a sudden you have the style guide could manifest. There's probably like a book, something analogous to a book someplace, but you're also going to have like micro content that tells you as you get to like each field, like this, there's sort of like, is it sort of embedded in the like that UI for the authors? Is that?
Yeah, I think at best you have an author experience that is really thought through. What does it feel like to be a person producing whatever this thing is? And that's been tested with those folks and like made, when they have questions, then do you fix things to clarify how it works? When people are producing content that isn't right, do you go back and look at, well, how could we make sure that they have better examples, right? Like, can you link to an example of a good version of this, or can you embed an example? That kind of thing is really valuable. And also things like, validation, right? So can you, for example, set a character limit that it has to be no more than and no less than a certain number, to get people writing to the proximate right lengths? And how much flexibility do you have there? Does it matter if it's anywhere from 100 to 300 characters? Or does it really need to be like 200 to 250, right? So like, and that's a question that comes down to, well, what is the content? Where is it going to be used, et cetera? But thinking through those sorts of things, I would say that's just something where up until pretty recently, that just wasn't anybody's job to really think through that, how all those pieces.
Right, because it was just like a CMS guy setting up the forms, basically. But I'm wondering now too, like how you've got me thinking, like all of a sudden I just pictured this future where you have like not just like character counts or other, but like even like an AI back end that's validating a form entry and saying, no, you probably want to work on this, like a grammar checker, or it could be a style, that could be a manifestation of the style guide. Is that, how far away do you think we are from that kind of stuff?
You know, I think that some of that is possible right now, but the thing is, I'm not quite sure how good that AI would be, but I think it's possible.
Right.
But the reality is, from almost every organization, it's not realistic. I mean, they're still dealing oftentimes with outdated tools. They're still trying to deal with outdated content. They're still dealing with the fact that they published all of this crap to the web in 2007 and they don't even know where it is. That I think it is much more helpful to still be focused on a lot of those human organizational components, like how do we help people understand this? How do we help people get more comfortable with this? And that's a lot of times, it's some basic improvements to the tooling that can yield a really big result in the content itself. I think that we often it's easy to over-engineer what we think is going to be a solution to these kinds of problems. I think we've already seen that in content management, a lot of assumption that like, well, if we just lock down everything, or if we just do this, if we just do that, we'll fix the content problems. And we have not fixed content problems because content problems are fundamentally, kind of people problems. And so I really think that we want to invest time there.
Yeah, I'm curious. So it seems like, I mean, what I'm gathered from like a lot of the reading and talking to you now is that like your top level superpower seems to be this ability to convert all these insights about how this stuff should look into actual behavior change in both the individuals, like the authors, but also at the bigger level, like organizational change. You do a lot of work with that, right? Like,
yeah, I think that's a big part of what I do. Now, I mean, it's hard, and I wouldn't say every author I ever worked with has been like, I get it, and they're producing perfect structured content now. And I wouldn't say that every organization I've worked with has really gotten on board either. I would say that it's sort of a big long-term shift, and you have to look for improvements, and you have to look for what's going to be viable right now. I've certainly recommended to organizations that were really gung-ho about structured content to kind of go a little bit more slowly than they wanted to, in terms of things like don't bite off more than you can chew. Like, if you try to convert everything that you've ever done to structured content right now in the context of some other project, you might get overwhelmed and it might all fall apart and never get implemented. So can you identify things where you have enough organizational buy-in to make it possible? And sometimes it's something like, is there some content that is right now, really not performing for you? You're not able to do as much with it because it's really locked into these inflexible pages where there'd be a high value to converting that to something more structured. And just start there, do one thing at a time. Organizations will talk about getting rid of all of their 7,000 billion PDFs and converting those to structured content. And, if you actually run the numbers on what that would take, it's like, okay, well, somebody needs to do this kind of content modeling, and somebody then needs to do this kind of implementation of that content model within the system. And then you have to actually go through and do a lot of really manual work to convert everything and to, get it to match those structures. And you're suddenly looking at it as being like, oh, we're going to spend $500,000 on this. Is $500,000 an appropriate amount of money to spend on that or not? I don't know. It depends, right? It depends what kind of value is locked up in those PDFs. But I think a lot of times when people get excited about something, they don't necessarily think about like, this is actually hard and time consuming. And that's okay. It doesn't mean it's not worth doing, but when you bite off more than you can chew, you do get burnt out and then nothing actually gets implemented. So thinking about what's going to really be viable is helpful for maintaining some of that momentum.
Right. You just reminded me, I can't remember who I was talking to. Somebody recently said that they added a column to their content audit template that was just like a rough dollar value of the page, like kind of an impressionistic, qualitative, just kind of judgment level thing that I don't know was doled out maybe by the department or something. And then like if you sorted that big old sheet of like a page audit and said, okay, this, I don't know, you could probably just start to discern some patterns about what how to make those decisions, like you were just saying, both like not biting off everything and chewing it all at once, or that notion of how is it worth extracting the chunks from that blobby PDF? Yeah, yeah. I was going to ask you about so much of like the behavior change that comes with that at an organizational level. Like there's sort of like a new way of thinking about making those decisions as well. You mentioned earlier that it sounds like you're a genuine content strategist. Doesn't sound like you do a lot of the implementation. How do you set people up to cross that transitional chasm?
Yeah, I mean, I don't do a ton of implementation now, but I've certainly done it, which I think is part of the piece that's important, right? Like
Yeah.
getting your hands into a CMS and actually having to migrate content, actually having to produce content using different, fields and WYSIWYGs and whatever. I think that's important experience to have. And what I think in terms of kind of getting people to make that change and helping them over the hump is really around breaking the change down for them, making it not feel quite so overwhelming, and also not making them feel like the previous skills and experience they have don't matter. Oftentimes that, I think, is one of the big negatives, is people start feeling like they're being told that they don't know how to do their jobs, and it's like, no, the world is changing, or the world's already changed, and it's not that you are starting from scratch, but there's some shifts that that you've got to make in order to make what you do effective in this new environment. And I also really look at it as like an opportunity to build skills and look at progress and not worry if everything is perfect. So something and this is sort of like a conceptual thing that I think about a lot, is that, when you start doing things like structuring content, just like anything else, like anything structural or anything that's about a system, it's very easy to get caught up in like my perfect system, right? So like if you design a taxonomy and you're like, this taxonomy is perfect, and then somebody breaks it because they come up with something you didn't think of, or because they like miscategorize things or whatever, it starts to feel like, oh gosh, they're ruining my perfect system. I had it working perfectly. And I think that is very easy when it comes to structured content, right? It's like, we very carefully designed exactly how all of these different pieces and parts should work so that we have the right chunks for all the right places. And then lo and behold, somebody tries to jam a longer paragraph than they should into this teaser section. And damn it, like it doesn't work as well. It doesn't look as good when it goes to here or there, different destination. You can look at that and you can say, they screwed up my perfect system. Or you can look at that and say, well, they're starting to structure the content. It's a lot better than it was before. There's still improvement to be made. Let's try to figure out why they made those kinds of choices and go back to them and say, hey, here's something that isn't working quite right. Let's talk about, why did you feel like that was the best solution to whatever problem you were trying to solve? And do we need to make some tweaks to things to make things work better for you? But also, let's reiterate what we're trying to do here. I think once you let go of the idea of it being your perfect system and you accept that people are going to do some weird stuff, you can focus a lot more on the good and not get so concerned with all the rest.
Right. Hey, so that you just used the word reiterate, and I'm thinking of like disciplines like agile kind of methodologies, or things like design thinking that are very iterative and development. Like, there's so many ways you can do stuff. Are there processes like that, like any agile or lean methodologies and things like that taken hold in the content strategy world as you know it, or things like do people take a design thinking approach? Or I know there's a gazillion other models like that. How would you describe? Yeah.
So something I've thought about is that I've definitely seen people put sort of like agile practices and structured content work in opposition to one another. Like, oh, we do agile content, so we do content only as part of the design process. We're designing out X feature and we're going to work on the content for that feature at the same time. So this whole structured content conversation isn't relevant to us because our content practice is totally embedded in the design process and it's totally agile. And so I couldn't possibly design this like bigger system for content in advance. And I think that's sort of like a false tension to some extent, because I think, if you're going to have any kind of publishing system, then you are going to be publishing, you are going to need to have author tools and give people like sort of some amount of consistency to what they can do, where and when, which means, you're going to have some consistency around what types of content are people producing, why are they doing it, and those things are going to have patterns to them, and you can, kind of rein in some of what people might do otherwise by having, a system that says like, okay, you can do, your content types are how-tos and tip sheets and product sheets, whatever your different things are. And that where Agile really works well with this kind of content thinking is when you are kind of going through the process of figuring out, what's actually important to your users, and like understanding what people actually want and need, and then taking those needs and developing content to suit them. So it's like, okay, well, we're going to, we have a broad, like high level sense of the structures of content that we really need. Now, as we're going through and we're actually producing things for all of the different user tasks, let's make sure that we're getting appropriate user needs in there and testing it as we go. And maybe even improving on the models that we have, right? If the content models don't end up being the perfect right way to answer a user task, then you might need to tweak the content model. And then you can kind of keep building on that. But I do think that there's a lot of efficiency to be gained from, not starting your content design process kind of with like complete blank slate all the time, right? Like every time you have a task that you want to create content to resolve for your users, you don't necessarily want to be like, well, what should this content be? It could be anything. You might want to have a sense of like, oh yes, well, for the kinds of tasks that we tend to have, these are the content types that tend to make sense. Which of these makes the most sense? Or if, do we need actually to come up with something new? I think it can really make you a lot more efficient and lean if you rely on having some of these patterns, just like you would having design patterns, right? You're not going to start your design process by saying like complete blank slate. You're going to go back and you're going to say, well, these are the UI patterns we have. These are sort of the broad art direction that we have. What fits what we're doing right now the best?
So there must be, are there libraries of content structure patterns or things like that, like there are in so many other design realms?
I have seen some of that, not a ton. I think, what's it called? I think it's called Polaris. The pattern guidelines for Shopify are pretty extensive and include a lot of content design patterns as well. That tends to be more UI content there than it is sort of the like meaty stuff we're talking about that usually needs more structure in a CMS. I've seen some more organizations, though, start to build out some kind of internal guidelines and examples of like, here's what we mean when we have this kind of structure. The other thing I typically also would look to is trying to find some commonalities across different content types for certain things, like that across an organization, we might have 15 different content types that are going to have different, short descriptions. Well, let's not make short description over here for this content type, this length, and over here, this length. Like, can that just be one consistent thing? So you start having more blocks that work across all of your content,
Right.
as opposed to kind of treating every content type as a, special, unique snowflake.
Gotcha. Hey, two things. One, we're just about at a half hour now, and I know I wanted to kind of honor your time and keep this. So, and I knew this would happen. I can think of 1,000 more questions for you.
Yeah.
But also on that last point, well, actually, maybe we should just. God, I feel like I want to have a whole other conversation about this. But I'm sorry, I forgot what I was going to ask. Oh, but back to the like the patterns that like Polaris, I think you said, and Shopify. Yeah, it is interesting because it is like you talked about the almost a conflict between agile methodologies and a system that's kind of codified and locked in place. And I'm thinking of like the old I forget the original business guru who talked about giving assembly line workers the power to stop the car assembly line and things like that. Are there analogous things in the contents in this whole content ecosystem that empower people further down to like? It just seems like there's a lot of good information probably happening down there that could it's maybe not in a pure agile methodology way, but
Mm.
ways to feed back into this and improve things over time.
I don't know about sort of specific formal tools and things like that, but I do know some examples of things. I have a friend who has this really interesting position. She's at Vox Media, working on their platforms, like product team. So basically, she's the one who is working on their CMS, and which is a pretty important tool for them. I mean, they're a publishing organization with a lot of different online platforms, but also, one of the things they run is SB Nation. SB Nation is this huge sports blog network, so it has a ton of contributors. It's not like just a handful of journalists who work for Vox Media. It is all of these contributors as well. So her job is really interesting. She's in charge of what they historically were calling kind of community, which is basically like all of those relationships with all of those different authors. And it's an interesting combination of like support. So like when those people have problems using the tools, what happens? And UX, so how do we improve the systems for them and gather feedback from them? And how do we also do more of the like product management? So when we roll out new features, how do we get them onboarded to those? How do we help them use this tool effectively? And having a role like that, I think that's sort of like, in a lot of organizations, that is not territory that has been particularly well charted. And I think what they've found at Vox, so something that happened recently, is they had rolled out a new version of their editor, and it had been live for a while, but the old version was still there too. And one day they quietly shut off the old version and got no emails about it. And what that means is that they had so effectively gotten people to want to use the new system that when the old thing wasn't available anymore, they didn't have angry people. And I think that that is a testament to them really thinking through this process of change and thinking about how they could make sure people knew how to use the new thing. And the new thing was indeed so obviously better for the people who had to use it that it was just a preference.
Gotcha.
So I think having that role has been so beneficial to them to be able to do that.
You actually asked my question better than I was trying to, but that's kind of what I was getting at, is like that role. It seems like there needs to be a role that spans all of this stuff we've talked about. What level is she at? Is she like pretty senior, or how, like how does that, and I can picture that role at many different levels. How do you, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a role that I think when they started it, it was unclear what exactly this role was. And, she was experienced, but it wasn't like she was in like a leadership role exactly. It was like sort of her running this, just like kind of her defined corner where she would go in and she would like, produce like, okay, we're going to launch a new feature. Let's produce the like help guide for it and a little video to show people how to use it, and then let me communicate that out to all of the people who got it, right? So it was at that kind of level. But they found that role was so valuable, and that the insight that she was able to bring because of that role was so massive to the organization that it needed to be elevated within the organization. And so now it is a director level role, and she has additional people on her team who are doing some of that stuff that she did when she started, where she's now working directly with, chief product officer, because they need a way to basically feed those kinds of insights from people on the ground using their tools up into the product and into the development cycle for how that product improves. And they needed sort of that connection point between the people using the tool, the content that's being produced, and the technical direction of the product.
Interesting. Well, I think I'm sure we all would love to think that, it's kind of validation of the importance of this work, and this fact that content really is like king across, not just in publications, but across enterprise as well. So it's good to see people like her kind of rising up there. Cool. Well, I think we're coming up on about 40 minutes, so I'd like to wrap it up now, but God, thanks so much for having you on. It occurred to me as we're talking, Sara, I'm sitting in the co-working space where you spoke when you were in Seattle a couple weeks ago, and I'm actually looking at the stage you were on, and I only realized that halfway through this interview, so there's some kind of fun little circle being resolved here. But we'd hope to talk today a little bit about, there's this whole other field that you're so such a spokesperson for around inclusion and empathy in design and compassionate consideration. I would love to revisit that, come back and talk to you about that. Your new book, Technically Wrong, hold this one up too. I'll have these in the show notes. But anyhow, thanks so much for being on the show today. Anything last you'd like to say while you have the ear of my audience?
The only thing I would say, as we're talking about things like, in the new book where I talk a lot about bias in design and building more inclusive software and stuff, is that I think one of the things that's really guided a lot of my work, and that I hope guides a lot of all of our work, is this idea that, we've got all of these users who we'd like to think we understand, but we actually don't know that much about. And they're going through almost anything you can imagine, and they're trying to access your content or your tools in almost any scenario that you can imagine, and that we really just don't know when or why somebody might be using our product and how diverse those people are. And so I think it really speaks to the need to have content that's going to work for people who are using almost any kind of device, and people who are in a hurry and need to be able to skim, and also making sure that we're designing things so that they're inclusive to people and that they work for people across all kinds of abilities and backgrounds, and that we're thinking about a really broad range of people in the decisions that we're making, no matter where in the process we work. I think every single one of us needs to always keep that front and center.
Right. No, and I think, I'm hoping that's becoming increasingly not a hard sell. That there's so many benefits and values to inclusion, not just accessibility and roping people, but also like better business results. So, well, let's talk about. I know you're busy, but I'll try to get you on my schedule again down the road to talk about that in more detail. But thanks again. Thanks so much for being on the show, and I'll go ahead and wrap it up here.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another content strategy interview.